Okay, so today, as we approach abstract landscape painting, I'm going to go over several different techniques that are going to help to add texture and interest to your landscape painting. The technique that I'm starting right now is a technique using masking fluid. What I'm doing right now is I'm putting rubber cement on my watercolor paper. Uh, this is Arches 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and I'm just going over the surface in some areas, and I'm using the rubber cement uh, to protect the white part of the paper. And I will, once I'm finished putting the rubber cement on, I'll give it 5 to 10 minutes to dry, and then I can begin to apply paint. You can put the rubber cement on thick or thin, and later, once it dries, you can lift it up with a rubber cement pickup tool or your fingers. Okay, so I've let that rubber cement dry. You could also use masking tape or masking fluid to mask out the areas that you don't want pigment to touch. So you could see how the pigment is bubbling up on areas where the masking fluid is repelling it. The paint colors I'm mixing right now are a combination of Prussian blue and sap green. What I'm interested in doing, since this is a landscape, I'll be using colors that I really like to experiment with uh, in the outdoors. I love to go out and sketch and paint from life. I won't put a photo up of the image. I'll just, since this is an abstract landscape, I will let it develop. Um, you could just watch the technique and watch the image develop. You can paint from life. You can go outdoors and do an abstract landscape painting it plein air, right from life, or you can get some photo reference and do an abstract painting referring to photo reference, or you can just do this from your memory or imagination. So the technique I'm using right now, there's some areas that are masked off, and I'm blending wet into wet. So my brush is pretty wet. You can see I'm dipping it in the water. I'm lifting up paint, and I'm blending directly on the surface. So this technique is called blending, where you blend one color into another. And you can experiment with the different degree of opacity of that pigmentation. It can be thinned with water, or you can have a much more saturated application of color. And right now I'm just experimenting with earth tones. I'm experimenting with broadening my limited palette, and to this palette I've added Prussian blue and Indian red, and as you can see in the bottom, I'm experimenting with a mixture of Indian red and raw umber. And then in that wet field, you can see I'm going over it with a toothpick. I'm scratching into the surface of the Arches paper with the toothpick. And this technique is called Sgraffito, which means to scratch into the surface. And that's a wonderful way to get a texture of maybe some brush, dry brush. And then I'm going into that Sgraffito with some more highly saturated mixture of the sap green, and then going back in with the Sgraffito, the toothpick. You can use any sharp instrument, the back end of a brush, a toothpick, or any instrument you have in your toolbox with a sharp point. And that color that I'm bringing into that area is burnt sienna. So in that underbrush area, I have a mixture of burnt sienna. Okay, and right now I'm doing the dry brush technique over to the right with burnt sienna. You can see where the dry brush is different from the Sgraffito. With the dry brush, you dry your brush, and with the palm of your hand, you scrunch the brush. You push the brush into the palm of your hand to separate the bristles, and then you select a saturated amount of paint and then softly brush over on your surface. And you'll pick up the texture of the paper as well as the texture of the brush. So I'm creating a tree shape, a bark limb, and here you can see where the masking fluid, the rubber cement, is repelling the water, and so it will not become absorbed into the paper in those areas, and that's gives you a really nice bark texture. And later I will pick up the rubber cement once the painting is dry. Be sure that you do not try to rub into the painting until all the paint has dried and absorbed into the surface. Otherwise you'll just spread the paint onto the paper and you may not like the result. So I have a mixture here of the burnt sienna, sap green, and yellow ochre. And I'm using that mixture to create the bark of this tree. I'm using a round brush, and you can use the tip, as you see, to create details, and then allow more of the brush, the side of the brush, to thicken your branch. So the nice thing about a round brush is you can use the more of the bristles you press into and let go of. You can have a thicker stroke, or you can use the tip for a thinner stroke. So right now I'm going over the whole upper area with a very, very light wash of that bark color. It has some sap green in there, so as we thin the paint, you can see the sap green coming through. And this is giving my painting an overall sense that we're in the forest. My intent was to do a detailed tree in a forest area. And you can see where that masking fluid is really helping to give us some nice texture of reflected light through the forest. Now I'm dipping into a highly saturated mixture of Venetian red with cad-free yellow. So I've got the cad-free lemon and Venetian red to have this very deep, warm color indicating sunlight. And right now I am applying salt to the lower brush area. This is called the salt technique. I'm using fine table salt, iodized salt, and the salt will draw the pigment toward the crystals and help to create a very fine texture. You can also use kosher salt and pretzel salt. The different grains of salt will give you a variety of texture. It's up to you to experiment with how much pigment and how much water you're using, how wet is your paper when you go in and experiment with the salt technique. And the salt will give you that granulated texture. Here I'm applying highly saturated amounts of paint to the salt. For the shadow areas, I'm going back in with my mixture of Prussian blue and sap green. The light is hitting the tree at the right side, so I'm going to be very conscientious of creating a deep dark shadow behind the tree and allowing that white from the tree to remain on the right side of the tree. Here I'm blending a variety of greens into each other. I'm adding some of that Indian red into the green, and maintaining that white edge along the tree. And this is called blending, when you paint wet into wet, one hue into another hue. There I'm using the tip of a round brush. So for this painting, I'm mostly using a size 8 round brush and a 1-inch flat brush. Paying close attention to my shadow areas. So even though this is an abstract landscape, I'm still using the principle of light and shadow. I'm not concerned about making this look too realistic, but I do want to have that sense of light and shadow, which will help, that contrast will help to direct the viewer to a focal point and give the viewer a sense of design. Even though you may be working with abstraction, you still want to pay close attention to your design concepts, the principles of design. For the branches of the tree, I will consider a variety of value and hue changes with that mixture of Prussian blue and sap green. Here I was blending wet into wet. When you blend the wet into wet, you get those nice soft edges. Okay, right now I'm using the alcohol technique. I could have let the pigment dry and soak into the paper a little bit more, but I'm using a straw, and I'm dipping straw into rubbing alcohol, and the rubbing alcohol will cause the pigment and the water to move away from the alcohol. So as you can see, you're getting a soft halo around those shapes that are created with the straw. If you want your shapes to be more defined, then you want to let the pigment soak into the paper a little bit more. And then you would apply the alcohol before it's completely dry. So now I'm going back into some areas with rubber cement. I let the paint dry, and I'm putting another layer of mask, another masking layer in the background, and I let that dry. And I'm just going to go in and put additional texture. So now I can put another field of color into the upper level of the painting, mid to upper level. And the masking fluid will mask off some areas. So on this painting, I used 2 layers of masking fluid, once in the beginning and now toward the end, just to add more depth. The more you layer textures and let the painting dry and put in masking fluid, you can put in another layer of color, and that's just going to give more depth to your painting. So pay close attention to value and texture and depth to create interest in your painting. You can see how when using the round brush that the bristles spring, so you can use the tip and add a little bit more pressure, and you'll get a thicker stroke. So to move from thick to thin, you just add pressure to the brush, and more of the paint will flow from the center of the brush. So really load up your brushes with color. Now I'll finish the background area with just a little bit of the Winsor blue, a very thin amount of Winsor blue, just to give a sense of sky in the background. And I still have my masking fluid in there in some places, and that will allow for that feeling of texture